All right, so before I go and introduce the amazing and the wonderful Maaza here, what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction about the Polis Project and what Dissent in Dangerous Times lecture series means. Polis Project in some ways is a work, a collective of people who are angry and full of angst and trying to change the world in some ways. I know it's funny for the people who've known us for a long time. But actually it does come from this angst and these conversations that we've been having for so many years about how reportage and research is not having a conversation with each other. And often what happens and who loses out in that process is the acts of resistance, which means that this collective brings together writers, scholars, activists to come together and create an intellectual, political, and a community for thinking and creating this resistance in ways that will help us move the conversation forward. What that really means is that we try to not only look at simplistic ideas and arguments that have often led to nothing more than more confusions and disagreements, but to actually engage with complex ideas and in ways we can collaborate and work together. So Dissent in Dangerous Times is our lecture series, which means that this is our way of somehow institutionalizing and creating a space for these complex conversations and ideas by some incredibly phenomenal people who have worked on this, thought about this for a really long time. So the question is, on a given night in New York City, you have at least a few hundred conversation series. So why this? Why now? I think that's a very valid question. But the truth is that while we have so many conversations happening at a given night, majority of these conversations are at best banal and at worst really, really dangerous. And the reason I say that is because this again comes from a very personal experience almost 2 years ago. I was in one of these conversations at a very storied foundation in New York City. A New Yorker editor was in conversation with a very renowned writer who had written a book about Iran and cybersecurity. And his exact words were, "It's us versus them, and we're going to kick Iran's ass." And sitting there almost 14 years after 9/11, and as someone who came of age in those turbulent years of 9/11, sitting and listening to the same conversation about us and them in these storied places was both appalling. And 4 questions down, I asked the question, "Is it okay for you to say this?" And the entire room stood up in applause. They applauded not because I'd asked a difficult question, they applauded because everybody had that question in their mind, but nobody had asked it. And that is problematic because in storied institutions in New York City, if we still continue to have conversations like us and them, we are going to kick Iran's ass or replace it with Yemen or Syria or Russia, then there is no place for conversation. And what really makes a difference is that when people speak up, there is value to speaking truth to power. And in our ways, it is bringing those incredible voices, writers and thinkers to have those conversations. And that is why we start our conversation with the amazing Maaza here. Again, I met her and another very dear friend, Bhakti Sringarpure, on the same day. Yes, I actually met both of you on the same day. This was the panel that Bhakti had put together on Ethiopia that you had curated. Another dear friend, Asim, had just put me in touch with Bhakti, and Bhakti said, "Why don't you come for this panel that I'm putting?" And it's the same day, I think I asked you a question after, and you were really busy, and Bhakti was very pregnant. I hadn't become friends with Bhakti, or I hadn't got to know Maaza yet, but on the single day I met 2 incredibly amazing women. I think it was 2013?
Maybe, yeah.
Time flies.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy that we have Maaza here. Before I go and give the long list of the things that she's accomplished and she's done, personally I would like to say that she's someone who's not just a remarkable writer, but she's a genuinely wonderful person. She's generous with her time, and also someone who's just lovely to listen to and read. So I'm thrilled. But then I still have to finish the bio because you all have to go and buy the brilliant book that she's written and another forthcoming one that's coming. Maaza is a novelist and an essayist. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and many other publications. Maaza writes fiction, nonfiction, and examines the individual lives at stake during migration, war, and exile, and considers these questions in the intersection of photography and violence. Her work can be found in The New Yorker, Granta, Guardian, New York Times, Rolling Stones, BBC Radio, and the list goes on. But you can Google her, and I'm sure you'll find a million other things that she's written that's lovely and incredibly inspiring. Her new novel, set during the fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, is forthcoming. So without much ado, I will open the table for you, and we'll let the conversation begin.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, it has been a while since we've met, and I have to return the compliment to it. It's always a joy for me to read what Suchitra writes, and every time I read something that you have written, it just generates more thinking on my part, and more complication of what I've already been thinking about. So it's really wonderful to be in this conversation with you. I'm going to read from a piece called Unheard of Things. I won't say much more about it, but it's something that is an ongoing conversation that I have been having with myself. And so every time I give a talk, I've given this before, I come back and think about it and I add on. So I've added on some things, a substantial amount for our conversation tonight, and I hope that generates more thinking for me. There's a saying in Ethiopia, when the one who will be killed is in the presence of the killer, there is freedom. In that moment, there is nothing left to lose. It is possible even to do unheard of things. I am in London on a cold November morning, and the last of the 900,000 red poppies will be placed around the Tower of London, one for every soldier from the UK and the Commonwealth who died during the First World War. It is a scorching August day, and the world has fallen silent as a young man in an orange jumpsuit is paraded across a sandy hill and made to kneel. It is April, and another group of young men, Ethiopian like me, are marched across both sea and sand and made to kneel. I turn my head, I close my eyes, I shut my ears. Unheard of things. The Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe says that all those men in Nazi Germany who put their talent in the service of racism have been rightfully condemned for their perversions. He seems to imply that in the end, true talent cannot be twisted. A gift cannot be subverted and subsumed by evil. That talent is a virtue, stalwart, loyal as a well-trained soldier. Arthur Rimbaud gave up the pretense of poetry, Achebe says, when he opted for slavery. But I have been to Harar, the city where Rimbaud lived. I have seen some of his belongings. I know that when he put down the pen, he picked up the camera. I have borne witness to his vision of those with skin just like mine. There is beauty in the frame. There is poetry. Poetry surely can only be on the side of man's deliverance and not his enslavement, Achebe contends. This I want to believe. Perhaps like some of you here, I come to this language of English secondhand. I have fallen between its cracks, trying to trudge my way towards comprehension. I have marveled at its flexibility, but never so much as in recent years. What I have seen, what we have seen, is language forced into the service of violence, a rhetoric of desperation and devastation molded into the incomprehensible, then vomited out in images and words that we cannot ignore, though we have tried. It is a language both cruel, both strong enough to reside in troubling landscapes, and malleable enough to be both poetic and cruel. It has the capacity to draw us in and push us back and send us spinning with speechless grief. while those red ceramic poppies want to remind us of the transcendent power of memory and imagination, the ISIS videos want to drive home that we are, in the end, no more than our bodies, that we are all interchangeable political symbols knotted around a stoppable heart. Both the installation and the videos demand that we take note and look. In both instances, our gaze is the first step in receiving a prescribed message. Yet to watch the ISIS videos involves a heart-rending complicity with the murderers. Our gaze would be an instrument in the oppression depicted, a continuation of the vulgar narrative. But it is a narrative. It is language. It communicates. It is poetry because it is a language of representation. All those men clad in orange, dragged across sand and sea, have been reduced to brightly colored metaphors. All those poppies, blood red and stuck in dirt around the Tower of London moat, were once full-bodied men strewn across battlefields. One reminds us cruelly of our fragility. The other tries valiantly to shield us from the ugly stink and rot that also makes up who we are. I'm speaking of violence that is put on display. At its most aesthetic, it strips back and erases a harsher reality. At its most garish, it is a billboard for all our most human and most primal fears, a symbolic language come to us so fully and frightfully formed that we have not always found the words to confront it. When it comes to war, when it comes to violence, it seems we have not always been able to keep up. We have not always been able to locate the vocabulary that will take us from shock and stunned silence toward a coherent, visceral speech, one as strong as the force that is charging at us. I've long believed in a concerned writer's need to look at photographs of violence. The power of our particular gaze has the ability to reshape a narrative and turn victim into human being. Then came the videos. Then came the requests by the families of the victims to remember them as they had been, alive and active, rather than as they were intended. Yet in the aftermath of the shock, in the deliberate decision to look away, where is there to settle a gaze when turning away feels like forgetting? To look is to be a pawn in the propaganda. To turn away is its own kind of acquiescence, one that renders these victims as symbols. I know what Achebe is saying. I believe in what he says. I believe that art carries the potential for vast and dramatic change, but it also carries discomfort, and it is by its nature both a tool and a weapon, both a salve and a poison. It is not only the righteous woman who holds a gift. It is not only the truth teller who can be heard. If language can withstand and support the heaviest, most brutal of activities, then this is also a testament to its inherent strength, one that can allow us transcendence and peace. But the stakes are high, and though they may be no higher than they have been in other decades and centuries, you and I are here now, in this moment in history, and somewhere in this swirl of unpredictability is the writer's place. For years I have been searching for that point, that axis on which good seems to pivot too easily towards bad. I want to know where the ground begins to shift, and how language both erodes and glues it back together, and what there is to be done about it. I'm talking about our responsibility, our duty in the face of those unspeakable and unheard of things. How do we begin to construct a vocabulary if all we can do is stand in numb and silent grief? What is there to really see of those who once stood and then were forced to kneel, if all we do is look away? It is Friday, September 16th, 2016, and it is close to 11 p.m. I walk into a dark and cavernous room lit only by the dimmest light. I am at an armory converted into a performance space, and I'm here to listen to professional mourners from all over the world, Cambodia, Burkina Faso, China, Ghana, Albania, India, Bhutan, Colombia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. They are here to take part in artist Terence Simon's exhibit called An Occupation of Loss. Each group of mourners sits in a hollow, silo-shaped structure that opens at the top for their voices to escape. There is a doorway just large enough for me to bend down and step inside so I can stand in front of them as they sing and lament. I do this because I am curious. I do this because I find Terence Simon's work to be powerful. I do this because once, before the revolution that began in Ethiopia in the 1970s, I used to have 3 uncles. Now they are gone, and my family and I still cannot find the proper way to mourn. The regime that disappeared them and countless others used fear to alter our grief. The former Ethiopian government used grotesque displays of violence to stun us into silence. We learned to stop looking at those they paraded in streets and in squares as examples. We turned away from those 2 awful signs of our own frailty. They never returned some of the bodies. We learned to pretend they were properly buried. And today the loss still sits, waiting for words to make it real. I am standing in front of 2 Azerbaijani mourners, women dressed in black. The silo is tiny and their eyes are closed. Their faces are lifted to the ceiling. I cannot understand what they are saying, but I understand what they mean. It is there, in the way they pound their chests and their voices crack. That first utterance is a cry. It is a long lament that climbs above my head and ricochets off the ceiling to fall back down. Soon, it is suffocating in that cramped space, and I want to leave, but I force myself to stay and follow the path these women have laid in front of me. This is, I think, where grief finds its voice, in our first cries, our first shouts into the unknown. Yet as the women continue to wail, I begin to realize that it is easy to be trapped by sorrow, that those early signs of mourning can get stuck in an endless cycle. We can spin in circles, constantly coming back to our first uttered cries of anguish, unless we shift away from what has been lost towards a way to express what must be reclaimed. Fear, I begin to understand, functions like this, in abstraction, hard to wrestle and contain unless we give it form, unless we shine the light into that dark corner and step in to confirm it is ours to dominate. What I mean to say is this: we must force language to carry the weight that we are slowly, horrifyingly realizing it is capable of bearing. The language cannot grow to its full potential, however, if we leave certain words unsaid. If some things are deemed too hideous to understand, if we must distance ourselves from all that does not hold sway to our own beliefs. Fear, like grief, I begin to see as I turn to leave that silo, is a space that is outside of language. It needs no words to flourish. It roots itself in our most incoherent and primal emotions. It gains strength by the nature of its shapelessness, by its ability to sit inside us and expand until it suffocates. Only language forces it into a form. Words add coherence and move it from abstract expression into an experience that has a beginning and an end, like a sentence.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very powerful.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to go through some of the questions that I had while you were reading, and then we will open it up for questions. You spoke about our duty and our responsibility when we see an image.
Yeah.
But today, I'm sure today, I did this today because I wanted to see how many images I saw today. From morning, I've seen about 120 images, and I think and I kept account because I really wanted to see how much, and I wanted to bring that number.
Yeah.
So on an average day, if I spend, say, a couple of hours on the internet, I see about 100 images. In that context, what is our responsibility and what is our duty? And I ask that because you work with images and you work with language in a way that is trying to excavate what it means to lose and think about it. So what is our duty and what is our responsibility?
That's a good question. I think there's a difference between just looking at what comes up on the internet and really seeing what it is that, how do I say this? Seeing what it is that is not there in that image. For example, we have all seen those images of people on an overloaded boat crossing the Mediterranean. There are cinematic, dramatic, beautiful shots. There are shots that try to convey how harrowing it is. We've all seen these things. We've seen, I think the latest one was people that had been drowned in a rubber boat, and people were stepping over them trying to get out. The New York Times put these pictures up. How many of them, though, actually have the names of some of those people that they have photographed? How many of those photographs actually lead us into text that begins to talk about who some of those individuals might have been? We don't see the picture. We're only looking until we begin to question what it is that we are seeing and what it is we are not seeing based on that image. And I think, we get inundated with these, and so it becomes so easy to let them slip by. But you don't have to look at all of them, but to look at one and say, wait a minute, why is this person not named? And it's the age of the internet. Email the photographer, email the editor, start making noise about that stuff. MSF, the C_C, they're on the internet, but one of the things that they've been doing, Médecins Sans Frontières, is that they have changed the language that they use to speak of those people who are fleeing and coming on boats that they rescue. And one of the first instances that I noticed with this is when they had a photograph. They didn't show faces. They just showed maybe some of the clothing that had been discarded or the bags that were on the boat from all the people that they rescued. And they said, we've rescued 149, I'm making up the number, but 149 people, they are our guests. Here are some of the things that they left behind as they are on their way for food. We are so glad that we can help them. What a difference in approach that is. That's the way language can begin to change. And the images that are shown, they're all the same, right? They're all the same at this point. How many people on a boat do we have to see before we understand that there's a crisis? It's not a refugee crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a European crisis because the Europeans are the ones that have the problem, and we can move it over here too. But we're not taking pictures of those politicians in the boardrooms making the kinds of decisions that send people back to Libya and back to their deaths. It's what we see is not often the intense kind of looking that I'm talking about with that, and also the questions to ask, and start bugging those photographers and editors. I think we've gotten on Twitter a few times and harassed people.
But I do think it works, though. I don't think it does because
it does.
You think it does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not that it makes an immediate, because I've done that. I've gotten onto editors. I've written them, had back and forths. I had the same feeling. I was talking to somebody else, and I got in a really big argument once with an Italian publication that did a series of photographs. I said, let me show you some colonial photographs from the 40s that match exactly what you've done. Right. And then, of course, nothing happened. These pictures had already been published. When I was talking to a friend of mine about this, she said, actually, no, this is what you need to do, because the next time they think they want to do this, they're going to think about this response.
Right.
And so it may not be immediate, but if we do it, I do believe that people start thinking. We've seen what protests can do in this country already. But this is stuff that we can also take on individually and begin to do that.
Edward Said, while writing the foreword for Eric Auerbach's book on Nemesis, says that each generation has to figure out the optics through which they see reality. And increasingly, I feel that when I read something that you've written or Bhakti has written, there is a closer connection to the reality that I experience and the words that I experience when I'm reading you. On the other hand, when I do read the vast majority of other writings that write about things that I am familiar with, my experiences as a person, as a woman of color, as someone who lives in New York, someone who was born in India, someone who has traveled, I often do not feel that connection to reality. And I feel the same way about images. And when you tell me that you have to learn to see, do you believe that given the ubiquity of photographs that somehow we need to teach this idea of seeing? Or do you feel that it's more of an individual exercise? It's something that whether you have it or you don't. So I have had some very intelligent arguments from both sides. And often when I walk away, I feel more confused. So I was just wondering, what do you think? That reality of learning the reality and seeing it, how does it happen? Do we teach it, or is it more of a personal journey?
No, I absolutely think it's taught.
Okay.
Absolutely think it's taught. My own growth, my own process of learning how to see, and I'm still learning. It's come from years of reading, and moments when I have to stop and say, okay, what am I looking at? How can I place this image in a historical continuum? Where was it taken? When was it taken? What was happening in that moment? Which also lets me know all the choices that the photographer made. And then I begin to understand everything that's excluded from the frame, right? But that takes time, and that definitely can be taught. Absolutely. Sometimes we don't know the questions to ask until someone helps us see what is represented and what might be misrepresented in that image. It takes practice. I really think it takes practice.
And now that you teach,
Yeah.
is it something that you consciously teach your own students? How do you teach them? I'm always curious about how do you teach someone to look? I know these are loaded questions,
no.
and people have been contemplating this since the beginning of time, all the way, about this idea of seeing and what is beautiful, what is not, what is violent, what is not. But how do we teach? I mean, it's a philosophical question and a practical question, right?
Yeah. Well, I have a former student in here. Maybe she can talk about it. I don't know if I've taught it in class, Mary Catherine, about how to see. We haven't done images in class.
Yeah, we did. We started this semester, remember, with the...
Goya?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. With Goya's drawings from...
And I
The
feel
war
by
etchings.
zooming in on certain images within text and their significance, I feel like even though it was through literature, I think that really did communicate to the students.
There we go.
Yeah. No, it's always those questions because because it's a very difficult thing, and often it's hard to push these arguments on young people because as a young person when you come to society, the function of society is to indoctrinate you in certain ideologies.
Yeah.
To bring you into the civil society, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's a New Yorker, whether it's your alt-right mag. So everybody is working in the function of propaganda.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm always fascinated as to how teachers teach and how they think about it and how do they teach the other person to look and yet also maybe tomorrow question the way that you look, right? That's the most important thing, right?
So one of the exercises I give to a freshman class is to take out their cell phones, go into their photo albums, find an image of themselves that includes them in some way, but a photograph that people would be surprised that they carry around. It could be a family picture, it could be something else, but everyone has one of those. And then, you know, I want them without showing the class the picture. The first step is to describe exactly what you see. Exactly what you see. So I said, describe it to me as if I were blind and I can't see it. But the next step is, put that aside, and now I want you to tell me everything that you know about the moment that this image was taken. Or tell me about one person that's in here. Tell me about something that no one else would know just by looking at the image, but is contained in that image. And they can write for pages on that. And that's how you begin to understand everything that's contained in everything that we look at online as well.
I do something similar. I do that part. And then I do, after they do that, I ask them to take a picture of what they aimed to, whatever they wrote about, to take a picture to try to visually represent what. Because usually they're
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent.
And then they compare.
Yeah.
To see what's not in the frame, because I like to focus on what's not in the frame. And to speak to your question about how to look is, I really feel to teach how to look is to make images, to take your own photographs yourself, and that's how to, I guess my opinion is to how to look, because you do have your own ideology and how to think. So once you kind of like engage in images that you make yourself, it kind of helps you look. Your gaze changes. I feel like I've developed a whole new way of looking. The more images I produce, my gaze changes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Maaza, do you think there's a problem with a digital, that the photographs are very rarely objects that we hold in our hand, or objects that can wear over time or get destroyed over time? That there's, you know, I mean, I just wonder, we see so many images as digital images now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been trying to like digital, I think, for the last several years. I have been trying, and I finally this summer was trying to understand what is it about it that repels me so much. It's very convenient, it's very easy, and I think that's part of it too, because it is sometimes shocking to me that I'm pointing at something without knowing it, I just keep taking. And there's something about that, the efficacy of it, the quickness of it, that you're not in the moment of it. You're just concerned with photographing it. Whereas if I'm shooting with film, I'm actually aware of lighting. I know that I could maybe, but I'm not thinking about, well, I'll just fix it in Photoshop, or I'll add these filters. That's a whole other thing. And I can do this and this. It's actually, where's the light? Where's the dark? Where's my subject in relation to it? Where am I physically here? I can't necessarily zoom in, not on my camera. It's an engagement that I think is very similar to the writing process. I'm trying to like digital, because I've seen some beautiful images with digital, but there's something about it still that kind of rankles me, and I think that's what it is, because I've been thinking about that. And I think the fact that we have so many images now, it's almost like we don't have to think about what we're photographing, because we're just going to photograph it and then figure it out later. And you see, I think we've all done this. We go to a museum or we go to an exhibit and we're taking pictures of the work, and I just want to know who looks at that when you get home. Like, why are we doing that? Instead of actually taking the screen away and just staring and trusting your mind and taking a piece of paper and writing down what it makes you feel, instead of creating this plasticized image of a moment. It's about writing it down and engaging with it. Yeah, so I feel that about digital.
There's a very interesting conversation. So when photography first comes in, you have very similar conversation between artists who are painting and photographers.
I'm so old.
When the painters are saying, photography is so instant, it's not art. And then Edward Steichen finally, has his camera works and he writes this scathing, a thing. He says that, if I can get Picasso to give me a photograph, give me his painting, and if I can place a photograph next to it, who are you people?
Yeah.
And then a few years you fast forward, and then Kodak comes up with its 36 films, which means that everybody's like, oh my God, now you have 36 images?
Yeah, I know.
You guys are going to be so reckless, In that sense, do you feel that it's the time that people are, it's the shrinking of time that people are concerned about?
Yeah.
And because we've had these conversations, right? Like we have these anxieties about
I'm sure the Egyptians had anxieties when the scrolls were going out of style, right? I'm sure there was like all this conversation happening there too. Yes, I know that there's, digital has really in some ways sped up how quickly we get news, how we see what's happening all around the world. I mean, there are really good things about that. Trust me. I mean, you see some incredible images, made on digital. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just have a hard time with how it's so easy that it's beginning to replace lived moments. We're photographing them in order to look at them later, as opposed to put the phone down and actually walk through a museum, keep it away. Who cares that you saw the Mona Lisa, And you can't see it. Anyway, yeah. I mean, you can't see it anyway because you have 10,000 people photographing and they're not looking at it.
Right.
So that's where I have the problem with it. But we live at a certain pace, and it's almost as if we would rather be told things than have to take the time to figure things out. And I think digital is a symptom of that, in some ways. Yeah. Hopefully I answered your question, but yeah, that's...
people don't do this. There's this episode in Mad Men. I know people have forgotten Mad Men now.
No, I haven't.
No, you haven't? Okay. He says that there's something about the ad, and he says something about, oh, why can't you tell someone that you're getting married over a phone? And Don Draper says, you cannot frame a phone call, you can only frame a telegraph, That makes sense, right? Like you can only frame so many things. And this idea of holding something is important.
Yeah.
I'll just ask you one more question and open it up because I feel like there are a lot more questions that are, in waiting. This question of the aesthetics of the image. And this is a conversation I think we've had on and off about how now we are looking so much about the aesthetic beauty of the image that the politics is completely out of it. We look at the lighting, and that's the problem with the world press every single year, right? Every image is cinematic, it's biblical, it is huge.
Yeah.
And then you realize that it's been set up, it's been shot, it's been filtered, it's been changed, that you're so interested in the beauty of the image that the politics, the history, the struggle, the oppression that led up to that moment is completely gone.
Right.
So if you could speak about that, and then we can open it up, and then...
Yeah, I mean, when you're saying that, I think one of the people that the most famous is Salgado, right? Salgado takes these images of famine-stricken Ethiopia, and it's a mother. It's like the Pietà, mother holding a dying child, and it's lit so beautifully that you're in awe of that, and you kind of lose the fact that this is something devastating is happening here. Or you have, I think the aesthetics it's a difficult and unstable ground. I mean, on one hand, photographers want to get your attention. They do that. Our eyes are attracted to certain things. They are trying to photograph light and do things, if I'm understanding you correctly. So they do that. But this is where I think in many ways our job as the viewer is to begin to break down, move beyond the aesthetics. This is where time, it's a matter of time. I may not be able to look at everything, but if I'm concerned about certain issues, let me look at a few photographs and then break those down and try to analyze what exactly is happening. I think also, if there are any digital photographers here, people who work with Photoshop, maybe someone can help me understand what it is that I've been seeing for a little while now. I've been in, and I've seen this in Instagram, I've seen this in the news, but particularly when people go to shoot images of people who are very poor, people from countries that are devastated by war, people who shoot refugees, people who shoot Black people, Africans, Black people here in the US, Africans on the continent. There's some type of a process that's being done in post-production that's rendering the skins almost dirty looking. It looks like gritty. I don't know what that process is.
So
but
this was burning. So when you did the traditional darkroom,
it's burning.
it's burning. So you know the usual burning that you do in the digital darkroom is why I think Photoshop kind of have the same burning function.
Is that what they're doing?
But you also have so many. I still have the oldest Photoshop that doesn't have the curves and all of that nonsense.
Yeah.
But so I think what Photoshop tried to do initially is to manipulate your darkroom. But now you also get these presets, in which you get you can take a digital film, and they will give you multiple film options. So you can make the film, your digital photograph, look like it was taken in a film. And then you have options like the Tri-X, which is a very the grainy one.
Yeah.
You have the infrared option, which can make it look as if the infrared was taken out.
Okay.
And then you have the Kodak 600s, which again render.
But there's something else it's not a film look that's being done, and I'm particularly it's
The
what?
posterizing?
It's
Okay.
posterized, and it's also on Instagram. It's structured.
But
It's called what? Structure?
Structure.
Okay.
I don't know what it is, but what it does to skin, and it's been used a lot with people who are poor, with homeless people, and Black skin, is that it turns the skin into the texture of dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it again, and it turns the whites of the eyes so white that it's unreal. And I see this again and again, and it's everywhere.
Right.
I don't know what it is, but I'm seeing, and especially with photographers taking Black people and taking homeless people, it's rendering it's
Matte almost. Matte finish.
it's not even matte.
I know exactly.
Do you know
it's
what I'm
this-
talking about?
Yeah, and it's posterizing it, and it's also using it's posterizing it using a adjustment filter of inverting the photo.
So what the effect is of that process is to render skin, and if you see a homeless person or even an old person, it's a close-up shot, the skin looks so textured, the wrinkles look very deep. Everything is kind of exaggerated.
HDR.
And what happens with that is, okay, what is it that we are supposed to be seeing of this human being?
Mm-hmm.
What's being emphasized here through that process? And it's really disturbing to me that this is being done with certain groups of people. And why is a photographer doing this? It's the same reason that a photographer feels like they need to go kind of slum it and go into certain neighborhoods and communities, because it gives them legitimacy if they have these pictures from these groups of people. And it's a kind of an exploitation that happens in post-production.
Right.
I find that really disturbing, and that's been coming up more and more now.
There's these two documentaries. One is on Nakways. I think it's the war photographer.
Yeah.
There's this one scene, I think, where he's talking about the photographs of the victims of rape, and his post-production guy is working on it, and he says, could you make the face more darker? And there's another, there are multiple documentaries on Salgado now, which means that I don't remember the name of the documentary, but this came out before the huge Genesis project, where Salgado says something very similar to his post-production guy as well, saying that, oh, I want these things made dark.
Yeah.
So the sense of making the image, as you said, the texture of dirt, I think has a long history.
Yeah.
I think I think a couple of years ago did the image of this, the women, I think from South Sudan, who were children of, it was photographed, they photographed a minor who had been raped and was pregnant with her hands on the breast, naked with a big tummy. Again, if you look at the image, it's very texturized, very dark, often looking like the colonial plantation photographs of the naked women that were taken as scientific images. So I think there is a long history, but I think I need to go look at this new posterized
I'll
look.
send you some.
I will finish the day with that. So we will open up for question. I think Jeremy has a question.
I think I was just going to bring up with this issue of photography. I think the most famous examples in American popular culture were the O.J. Simpson photos in the early 90s. Where they did this, where they stylized it in a way so it's in shadows and that it's not as heavily posterized as I guess more recent examples. But that is like the striking image I think I can remember. He casts the shadows. He looks more sinister.
Right.
We did this with Obama occasionally too when he was president.
And Michelle Obama as well. She actually was depicted. There's so many, the backlashes, and also how she was depicted and how she was taken forward.
Right.
So let's open it up for questions. I know a lot of you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Raja. A couple of questions actually, both were slightly different themes. The first is that, frankly, today people have such short attention spans thanks to social media, especially WhatsApp, for example. That you need to, and
that's such a South Asian thing to say. That's a very South Asian, I think.
It is true. It is true, and I think it's a bane of our lives, at least in South Asia. WhatsApp is destroying society.
Oh
It's
wow.
destroying. And they plan to soon introduce, a charge for calls. And I'm waiting for that to happen so that people can get de-addicted. But right now it's just spreading hate. It's just a means to spread, rumor, fake images, photoshopped images and hate.
Yeah.
But that's it. But my question was, is this that, because of this fleeting attention span, you need, when you talk about images, usually a good photo is something that makes people stop. So a friend of mine won a Pulitzer for a picture he took in Afghanistan, and it shows the aftermath of the bombing. It's really terrible, and of course it made people stop. But I talked to a lot of people after that, and what an amazing picture everybody said. But the only emotion it was about the futility of violence, but not so much about the context of the violence, or anything more than that. So how do you have either construct an image or what could be done in order to give people the context of the image or to think about it rather than just for example when the boy died on the Turkish beach, for example, it was like, okay, the futility of it all, oh, this is so terrible, so sad. But what about hardly anybody really went into the politics of it, not too much. My second question is about the fact that nowadays, particularly after in post 9/11 world and so on, it's not just the morality. People don't just draw moral judgments on the photo, but also on the photographer for the photo. Give you an example. Maybe because I've spent too much time in Afghanistan, I'll say that there was a case where a journalist embedded with the Taliban. You had embedded journalists with the military, but he decided to embed on the other side. Of course, it made for an excellent essay and all that, and but it also earned him an enormous amount of diatribes. Because it was the battle lines were clear, the moral lines were clear, and here he was jumping the fence to going other side. So, how then does one construct any kind of a narrative, a balanced narrative, so to say, if there are already moral judgments being drawn, because images have been, being used for propaganda value, then how does a journalist know when what he's doing is not part of the propaganda for who he's filming? Is he being used, or is he actually, reporting?
Well, I mean, I think the part of what I think you're asking is about, I mean, the moral obligation that a journalist has. Certain things, I think a journalist being embedded with the Taliban, I don't, frankly, I mean, that's the job of a journalist. Is supposed to get the news. It's supposed to show us something that we have not seen. Once that journalist is there, then it becomes, and I think then the moral question becomes, what is that person going to, how are they going to convey, what is it that they're going to tell us? How is it that they're going to convey this information? Let me say, I don't know, maybe this is going to get me in trouble, but I really do think we need to hear both sides of something, of any kind of situation. I really do think that we need to be able to listen to things that might make us uncomfortable. We need to confront that. And sometimes journalists are the only ones that can go into some of these places that we cannot go. What they bring back and how they frame that becomes the moral question. Should they shield us from unpleasant truths because we don't want to see some of this stuff? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Maybe let me tell you a story that kind of, this is what generated some of all this thinking, and maybe this is also kind of what you're talking about. When James Foley was murdered, of course the video was there. His parents, his family asked everyone not to see it. I didn't see it. But I read the account in the New York Times of the journalist who did watch the video and then write about it. And all I had to go off to understand what was in that video was what the journalist wrote. And so I already knew right there that it was kind of already skewed. But the thing that the journalist said at the very bottom was, he made a comment about, and then Foley on his knees bravely lifted his head back for the knife. I said, okay, I get that we need heroes. I get it. Forgive me if this is bothering people, but I get that we need to see a heroism in this situation that was absolutely helpless. But the journalist at that moment did not do the job that he was supposed to do. It was skewed. It was a skewed reading of what was happening. And I think, did he have the moral obligation came in letting us know exactly what happened without trying to take away the discomfort of what was actually there. It's a roundabout way of maybe answering your question, but that becomes the journalist's duty, not going certain places.
So kind of adding back, I don't know if this makes sense of that. So in 2012, I was embedded with the U.S. forces in Afghanistan in this place called Paktika province. And when I got there, it was nothing like the embedded stories that I had read in all these years. And I didn't go as a journalist. I was still a graduate student, and I went there. I have no idea how they allowed someone who was not American, who was not a journalist, to embed, but they did. And what I realized was that almost everybody who was a part of the Afghan local police had some connection to the Taliban, had family who were actually local Taliban leaders. Often the people who are part of the jirga were members who were strongly implicated. And again, for them, it's not a question of Taliban or not Taliban. For them, it's a question of loyalties. It's a hierarchy of loyalties. and it's a lot more complicated than the good guy, the bad guy, us versus them. And I was always surprised that even within embedded journalism, even when the military restricted so much access, even in my case, I'm sure I was not given any access, yet the stories that could have still have been told with the kind of truth and integrity was not told. So maybe that's where, again, your idea of teaching people how to see comes in. So we'll open it up for more questions.
I was interested in hearing you speak about, you talked about how important it is to break apart images, but in terms of like the terminology, like say around what's really interesting in American politics now is that we've gone from the Obama era, which is like completely refused to use the term like Islamic terror, right, or Islamic terrorism, and now we've gone to the other extreme of that, where the terminology is really embraced, right, and so and you see it replicated in different writers' discussions of what's going on in the world every time there is an attack in Europe or whatever, and I'm wondering about how writers and thinkers can push back, not just like in terms of the broader, what the government is, that terminology, but in terms of attacking language rather than just the image. Because like you mentioned earlier, they really go hand in hand, where you see the same images over and over again, and you see the same language over and over again. So you see the same terminology describing and reducing certain groups of people to these, angry Arabs, the angry Muslims, or those terms become so. So how do you suggest? I was interested in hearing your thoughts around that. Like in terms of pushing back against not just images but the language.
The language that I'll use 9/11, but it's been going on for a long time. But 9/11 and especially even now shifted the rhetoric that we use to speak of Muslims, Arabs, into one of hyperbole. It moved from a language of kind of a rational discourse into something that was a language of extremes. And what hyperbole does and what hyperbolic language does is it completely erases a kind of middle ground. And so we feel like the only way that we can combat that is to go to the extreme of the other side. And now we're in this position where we have to begin to find our way towards the middle, but we haven't, the language has been erased from 9/11. For example, this idea that you're either for us or against us, remember Bush's thing. Okay, all these American flags started flying. I don't know what the rhetoric was that could have come to combat that. I don't know what it was that we were doing except maybe moving to another extreme of I'm not being coherent right now, but I've been thinking a lot about this. What happens when we're in this period where the only way that we can begin to combat things is by becoming as hyperbolic and as extreme as what's come at us. And I think it takes a lot of work, because I'm thinking of one term that I have been in my own little tiny world trying to work against, and that is the terminology of sex slave. And periodically I'll tweet something about it, but why are we using this terminology when really what we're talking about are women who are held hostage and repeatedly raped? What's happening with that term? Why are we using that term? What is it? Who said that was the correct term to use? What happens when you put slave and sex together And what is it doing to our minds and our imaginations when we see that again? It's completely obliterating what is actually happening and the kind of suffering that women are going through. We need to stop using that. But for some reason, it's like slave is worse than hostage. I'm not sure what's happening here with that, but if I'm making sense, it's almost like you use that and it completely erases anything else that you can use, because these two words are so volatile. And then you place them together and poof, there's no other language there to speak of. And it is something that I really, really think we need to stop doing with that. But I'm not sure if I'm answering any of anybody's questions, but this is what I've been thinking about. What happens with these extreme words that keep getting in?
So with the word sex slave, how would you, if you had complete control over this language, and then you could write a language, because you cannot fight using the oppressor's language, you cannot write with the grammar that is oppressive.
Right.
If you had the ability to take away this word and come up with something else, it doesn't have to be now, but how would you think about defining this horrible, not just the horrible moment, but the experience and the historicity of that person and their experiences?
They're hostages.
Right.
They're hostages. Mm-hmm. They are raped and abused, but aren't they hostages? Like, what's the difference and this is not rhetorical, what is the difference between someone who is held hostage and repeatedly abused, and then that way, or someone who is quote unquote sex slave? Because only women are sex slaves. It reminds me of like these really old comic strips where you see women in chains. It's like that kind of language that we're using now. But yeah, hostages is the word that I would use. That's what they've been kidnapped and they're held hostage. Okay. But there's something with this language that's taking away from the real devastation of what's happening, I think. I don't know who decided to coin the term and why we're using it. But that's a whole other thing to unpack.
Yeah.
But
any more? Yeah.
How does your work engage with the moral relativism of violence? The idea that the ultimate basis moral judgment is not universal, it's context specific.
Okay, ask me that again in a different way.
So how does your work engage with the moral relativism of violence? Mm-hmm. The notion that the ultimate standard or basis for making moral judgments is not universal.
Oh, that's very interesting. My novel dealt in some ways with a character that joined a revolutionary movement and worked in an underground cell as a revolutionary. And initially, he didn't believe in killing people. He thought that he joined this group to help, to fight in a way that was nonviolent against what the Ethiopian regime was doing. Eventually, of course, he had to partake in some of this. Is that what? So what he felt he would never do, he kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed until something else happened. This is how my work engages with it. The question that I think that I sometimes get asked as a result of that book, and people who have read it or people who've been in revolutionary movements ask me, is violence ever justified? And I think about a T-shirt that I will reveal my age, but who cares? I got it in 1989, a T-shirt that said on the front, it was the summer right after Tiananmen Square. And any of you who were alive at that moment, for me, it was a pivotal moment in my life to see what was happening in the square, to see the men standing in front of the tanks. It just shifted my worldview in every way. And after that summer, I bought a T-shirt that said, on the front is kind of boring, "Democracy for China." But on the back, it said, "You cannot massacre an idea." And I still have that T-shirt. when the KKK and the neo-Nazis marched into Charlottesville, for the first time in a very long time, I dug that T-shirt out and I put it on as I was watching the news unfold. And I wanted it. I wanted that idea. I wanted a tangible thing about that idea on me as I was watching the KKK. And the one thing I realized is that we fight what was happening in Charlottesville, what was happening in Tiananmen Square, what happens in so many of these situations is that, and in revolutions, is that the side of the oppressor will try to break people by breaking their bodies. You charge body against body, and in that way you hope to crush spirits and change history. The body is only the physical thing. It's only the first step towards something much larger. And so what the T-shirt was saying, in a sense, was that you can massacre people, you can kill people, but you can't kill this idea. So on one hand, it's something very affirming, right? That what violence does is only one step. That if you can't ever kill an idea, then we know that as writers and as thinkers, as intellectuals, as artists, when we engage in conversation and try to change thinking and ideas, we are really doing something that is much stronger than governments who are killing physical bodies. However, the thing that I started realizing when I was watching Charlottesville is that as surely as these ideas of justice and freedom, equality, all those things that the counter-protesters were marching for, all those things that those students in Tiananmen Square were marching for, as surely as those things cannot be killed, we are also watching the other ideas we don't want to think too much about, which is the racism, the bigotry, the misogyny, that those ideas too cannot be massacred. And this is where the work of all of us really begins. After the bodies clash, the ideas are still there on both sides, and this is where the work we have to do really rests. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a modern sociologist here. So throughout this talk, I've been wondering about Gayatri Spivak's canvas of alternatives. Not to push this into post-colonial debates, but how are you thinking about that in terms of producing images and languages?
Gayatri.
This is debate in post-colonial studies, where Gayatri Spivak really pushed post-colonial studies to think about, are Western, even though they're not white, like people of color or Western, can they still completely represent the post-colonial subject, the subaltern subject?
That's interesting.
So, given that kind of argument, I'm wondering, when we as artists, writers, scholars think about and produce images and languages, what's our responsibility? Where does it, what's our responsibility to the subaltern? Right. How can we move beyond representation?
I feel like you asked a couple of questions. Let me deal with maybe the first one first. It's less who you are. I mean, let's take a photographer. I think we've had this discussion on Twitter. You can there's this big push now within the photography world to have more women photographers, to have more diverse photographers instead of the typical white male. But I've seen photographs taken by women that are as, what's the word? Exploitative?
Yes.
Yeah, as exploitative as a man, right? I've seen photographs taken by someone of color, but it is a misrepresentation of whatever it is that they're photographing. It's not the person as much as a system or a way of thinking or an approach that I think that we have to really combat. When I see a white woman who has, takes over an Instagram page, and one of the first pictures she shows about life in a refugee camp is a naked child, a naked black child, then I have to say, wait a minute, why is this the picture? And why does this little boy have to be naked? When you're talking about a refugee crisis, surely there are other things. It becomes a way of seeing that's less about the person, less about gender, less about race, and more about a way of thinking that I think we have to approach it that way. I've seen some incredible images taken by your typical, not typical, but your white male photographer that have been incredibly sensitive and really dig into what that situation might be like for the subject. It really is about this, it's the system and the way that editors will sometimes instruct photographers, the kind of work that they will accept versus the ones that they will reject. So photographers will sometimes feel pressured to take these certain kinds of pictures for editors. So it's a cyclical thing.
I just like to just a slightly different point of view. If you permit. I feel that in general the field of humanities is frankly dominated by the West. If you look at sciences, things have started to equalize a little bit. Samsung, a Korean company, today can decide on the future of phones used everywhere. It's there. At least Chinese researchers can be invited to discuss about if cold fusion is possible. But where is it in humanities? Where are we reading, or for example, a Chinese version of the Opium Wars? Where are we, really talking about? At least, there are still people now who started reading about like Chinua Achebe talking about the Biafran or the colonial experience from an African perspective. But it's not. It's still the field is largely skewed in terms of it's like the framework, the parameters of it are still being set by certain nationalities and certain cultures. It's in sciences it's moved, but in humanities it's still not moved. So is it possible to have a fair interpretation if the framework itself is being set? I mean, in terms of publication, if you go to any of the publishing houses, if a manuscript were to be sent by an author from somewhere, would a random house here pick it up and publish it as that? If he or she were part of the diaspora, it's different. But if it was someone sitting there and sending it for publication here, would they be entertained?
Right.
I think he brought us rightly to the field of decolonizing everything, right?
Yeah.
That conversation about decolonizing. So, who produces knowledge? And so I'll let Maaza, because you've actually been pushing for this. So.
Yeah, it is still a problem. I can't pretend it's not a problem. I can't say that. But what I can say is that the more we are engaged in these kinds of conversations, the more I push in my industry or the work that I do, the harder I work to bring some writers, let's say from Ethiopia, to an American or to a Western audience. We push the lines. It's not done yet, but you're absolutely right. The thing that I want to trouble with this, though, is that the framework is there, but that doesn't mean that the framework we're not cattle. We're not just led and then we stay within the fence and kind of follow whatever parameters we've been given. Like, hopefully as curious and engaged readers and thinkers that we begin to understand that there is something else beyond what we've been taught. It sometimes is hard to find, but I do think this is why, for people who are really engaged in this stuff, the work is just that much harder for us. It's just, we have to put in that effort because it's not readily available. But I know that if I have a conversation with you on Twitter, or if somebody else jumps in, or I'm reading something, all of a sudden my world becomes expanded a little. It's not we didn't save the world, but I learned something new, and then we move forward.
In 2012, I was at the Eddie Adams workshop. Eddie Adams workshop is a workshop that happens every year in which some of the industry greats pick 100 photographers that they think are up and coming, and they, bring them to a militarized boot camp. Almost everybody there was white or European. I was the only woman of color, and we had 2 African photographers. One was African American, and the other one was from South Africa. And the South African photographer won this really cool. So end of the 2 days, they give away awards. They give away assignments for New York Times, camera gear. So this South African photographer won this amazing Nikon package, the best gear 2012 could give you. And throughout the night, we had other photographers. People are supposed to see and look and engage, coming and congratulating my friend who was in my team, who was African American, who looked nothing like the South African photographer. Yeah. The South African photographer was thin, tall, and bald. My friend was a little shorter. He was a little chubby, had this very Chicago swag about him. They looked nothing like each other. And yet, throughout the day, you had people come and have that. And the second question that one of us asked one of the panelists was, we used to have Susan Sontag. We had these people who were really engaging with photography in a real sense, only a few years ago. And today I feel that the theory that we talk about is not there, and we're not really having those conversations. Who was producing knowledge? And this was then someone who was the head of National Geographic, and this was a person who had the ability to commission hundreds of thousands worth of money in terms of photography over years, who said, who needs theorists? Who needs people to think about photography? We need photographers. And we need our boys to go on the field and shoot the shit out of it. These exact words, shoot the shit out of things. And I just kept thinking, here are impressionable 20-something young people, and then this is the best the industry. And again, these are not people who are, these are people who are considered the greats. They have a body of work, and yet the kind of information we put outside is absolutely appalling. And there's no critical, again, nobody will say anything about it, because that means that the next paycheck is not coming. They're not going to commission somebody who is loud, who's obnoxious, and who's going to question. It's easier for you to write to the editor and say, this is problematic. But it's harder for the photographer to write to the editor and say, this is problematic because the next time there will not be a paycheck. Right. Do we have any more questions? Did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've been thinking about this issue a lot lately, and I've been thinking about it in terms of the Vietnam War, because I've been reading, I had the pleasure of interviewing Thi Bui, who just came out with a graphic novel, and I went and saw sorry, I always mispronounce his name, and just this kind of reappropriation or appropriation of that American story of Vietnam, which has always just been about the American soldier. It has now been, because we have this generation now of Vietnamese refugees who've grown up and are producing their own incredible work. They've taken that narrative for their own. So to me, it gives me hope seeing that, because to see something that was so reduced, to these images that, really didn't see the humanity of who America was at war with, and now you see the other side of that. So in a way, there is, I feel like there is movement within that. At least is, I don't know, it gives me hope to see that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I just want to say that I went to, I don't know what it's called, but it's a military museum, upstate, an hour from here. And they don't call it the Vietnam War, they call it the Vietnam conflict. Yeah.
Is
And,
that at West Point?
yeah, maybe, if that's like an hour.
It's like an
Yeah.
hour away.
Yeah. It was, I was like, what? Like, that's the, what?
It was never officially declared.
I never knew that. And, yeah, so that was like only like a year ago. So I hope that, with the rise of that, that changes.
I went on the official tour of Charleston, South Carolina, and the tour guide does not refer to enslaved Africans even as slaves. The tour guide says, South Carolina plantation owners imported African rice specialists. Wow.
That's the language for you. That's
African rice specialists. I'm speaking actually to bring it back to images, because I should explain that one side of my family leans rather to the right. That the images in the like official Charleston, South Carolina History Museum or whatever are like, it's so interesting because they are showing the opposite body of images that we are accustomed to seeing from like the height of the plantation era, where we're accustomed to seeing images of slaves in ripped cotton shirts and with scars on their backs and like that the images that they were showing were of really dignified workers in really dignified working clothes, drawings, historical drawings, and photographs in like their Sunday best and everything. And so it was actually kind of like a mind fuck, excuse my language, because
French is always welcome.
because it was the reverse, depiction of the institution of slavery, where it was actually just about like a diversity of labor practices.
Language, you can make everything,
that's
sound differently. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, sorry, because I haven't but the thing that actually I'm also really interested in right now is because I spend a lot of time in community with people who are on the far left, talking about how images and journalism and how art and propaganda and agitprop can all be in service of movement building. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually really interested right now in this moment of how the right is using language and images, and I'm actually, because I feel like actually it's way more comfortable for me and my community to talk about what is the onus or the responsibility of scholars to the subaltern, but what actually is the responsibility of scholars and journalists and artists and photographers in this moment, knowing that the right is actually hijacking stuff that we produce to actually paint a very different picture of what's happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also more effective, right?
Well, they're more effective because what the singular emotion that they keep tapping into is fear.
Yeah.
And throwing, because they have one set of statistics, and then we have another set of, and so they give statistics, we throw back statistics, and it's this volleyball kind of effect, and I think part of what I've been thinking about with this piece here is that it's the fear that is the kind of the machinery behind all of it, and imagine if instead of throwing back statistics, we need to. So there's a group of people that are going to do that are going to fact check. But if we can begin to say, okay, what is the fear behind this? What is the fear that is being tapped into? And what can we begin to do, not to hammer it down, but to diffuse it in a certain way? I don't have anything concrete, so this is abstract, but if we're talking about the immigration, people are coming in. Okay, wait, let's talk about this. Who is actually going to those people in these smaller communities that are really afraid and saying, where are the immigrants in your neighborhood? And what have they done to you? I've been thinking, how do we begin to combat what it is? Because it is fear. And as long as you do that, fear is it's malleable and it's abstract. And until we start making it concrete, it just keeps growing. It's mushrooming right now. I don't know who's going through these neighborhoods and saying, walk me to the migrants, immigrants, people that are from somewhere that really frighten you. I will have protection for you. Let's go. They won't have anywhere to go. But I think this might be one of the steps that, I don't know who, I don't want to go there. But I mean, this is just, it's idealistic to think that this is possible, but somehow we need to begin to do something like this, diffuse this. It's right now, it's all knee-jerk, it's reactive, and it's based on imagined fears as opposed to what's actually happening.
And to end it on that, you said about form, and I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about grief and fear and how it's shapeless. And do you think that photography or writing gives form? What does it lend itself best to?
It does. It helps to create a kind of language
I'm saying
that we can begin.
Photos or writing?
Both.
Both?
I don't think you can have one without the other.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah. I really think that it's hand in hand. I taught a class at Tisch. It was human rights and photography, and I had these photographers in my class. One of them was a young Syrian woman who she fled Assad. Her father was a member of Assad's regime, and she had joined a revolutionary group, a young photographer, journalist. Her father, to threaten her, put her mother in jail. She fled because he said he was going to kill her, too. He killed her mother. She fled and came. She was in my class, and quite outspoken, and also had been through a lot. And so we were talking about the need for words with photography, and she just didn't get it. She was like, I don't need that. I just need to go out there and photograph these things. And it took a long time to, I would put images up without the captions, and then put up images with false captions, and put, so that eventually, I think she began to understand that connection. But it is, in some ways, when there's an urgency to what photographers are doing, they want to do what they know how to do without understanding how significant words are to that. But I do think that it has to go together. And this young woman is still, I think now she's getting her PhD. Yeah.
Right, if you have no more questions, then thank you. Thanks for staying here and for coming.